Hello. Now, I recently saw Soul Coughing on their "We Said It Would Never Happen" tour slash reunion tour in Chicago, and I wanted to talk about why that show was important for me to go to as a fan, and talk about how it was. But I want to start by providing a little bit of context, in case you're not a fan or kind of a more casual appreciator of their music, to just let you know why this was significant to me. So Soul Coughing, they were not around for very long. They started in the early 90s. They went up to about 2000. They were around for less than a decade. In that time, they made three records: Ruby Vroom, Irresistible Bliss, and El Oso, all of which I think are excellent. They're kind of a hard band to categorize. I mean, they fall under that like alternative rock, banner, which is so vague, but it's it had hip hop influences on it. It had jazz influences. There were a lot of sampling and some electronic-y stuff, and it was a very unique band. I don't think anybody else has quite sounded like them, before or since. Though they certainly had a good amount of influence for those who were in the know. And as they went on, that was an increasing number of people. Irresistible Bliss. Yeah, I mean, Ruby Vroom. It got good reviews, but it wasn't widely listened to by the general public. But then on Irresistible Bliss, they had a couple of decent scoring songs on the alt charts. Soundtrack to Mary and Super Bon Bon, especially, which is still one of their most iconic songs. And then the big hit was Circles, which actually from El Oso, which actually made it onto the mainstream charts. According to Wikipedia, it got up to number 38 on the mainstream charts, and number 8 on the alternative charts. So that's cool. And a lot of people found out about the band, as I understand it, through Cartoon Network, who would like air these bumpers using the song and stuff in between programs and whatnot. And so yeah, they were on the rise. They were gaining more fame, more attention, and then they broke up kind of prematurely. And Mike Doty, the lead singer songwriter in the band, he went on to have a solo career, which I followed very closely. He started out recording these kind of spare, very emotional acoustic songs on this album Skittish, which I think is wonderful. Then he kind of filled out his sound a bit on the album Haughty Melodic, which is I believe that's like an anagram for Michael Doty. I don't know, but I digress. And then yeah, from there he was pretty consistent, with records like Sad Man, Happy Man, Yes, and Also Yes, good records. Then in 2013, something kind of changed. So when Mike started his solo career, he would play Soul Coughing songs live, kind of stripped down acoustic. And he would, obviously also play his solo songs. But as the years went on, he would play Soul Coughing songs less and less until he stopped playing them at all. And fans began to notice that, not only was he not playing these songs, but he seemed kind of annoyed when people would, request them, or when they would even bring up the band. And we really didn't understand why until this book right here came out. This is Mike's first memoir, The Book of Drugs, which came out in 2012. And I just want to read an excerpt from this. This is fairly long. This is like, a page and a half, but I feel like it's important to hear for context. So sorry if this is boring, but we're going to do it. All right. I'm full bore batshit crazy with regards to soul coughing. If somebody says they love soul coughing, I hear fuck you. Somebody yells out for a soul coughing song during a show, it means fuck you. If I play a soul coughing song and somebody whoops, just one guy, I hear fuck you. People email my own lyrics at me, let the man go through, or you are listening oddly often. How weird is that to blurt somebody's own lyrics at them? And I type back, don't put that on me. I'm not that guy anymore. That guy's dead. If somebody comes up to me and says, I've been listening to you since 1996, that means I had a definitive youthful drug experience to an old CD, and now you'll never escape that band that you loathe, and you are forever incomplete without those three hateful faces, referring to the other guys who are in the band, which was an upright bassist named Sebastian Steinberg, who's incredible, a drummer named Yuval Gubai, something like. I mean, I'm bad at pronouncing things. And the sampler player, Mark G. Antonio. They all have last names that are difficult to say. Yeah, Yuval Gabe, I guess is how you pronounce it, and Mark Degli Antoni. I just always referred to them by their first names. But he doesn't even refer to them by their first names in this. He just calls them the bassist and the drummer and the sampler player. He's like so disgusted with them that he won't even use their names. Um, so when somebody hears your voice for the first time, particularly if they discover the record in school or at some developmental juncture, they stake out a little place in their minds for you. Your work can get more sophisticated, truer, closer to your ideal, but you'll never get out of that place. No song can make you get to them. It will fail to turn them 20 again. There are 6 or 7 soul coughing tunes that I like, mostly ones that sound more like my solo records. Of those songs, my bandmates' surliness and contempt makes way for keenly felt accompaniment, contraptual profundity. Honestly, I don't truly love more than 6 or 7 Jay-Z or Regina Spektor or AC/DC songs. I'm a song guy, not an album guy, but I tell you without hesitation that I adore those artists. Again, full bore, batshit crazy. There are a few others that I'm proud of as songs. I dislike the recordings, but when I play them by myself, I feel what they meant. Unless they provoke whoops of approval, in which case I'll immediately hate them. My insane / conniving bandmates convince some deep part of me that I'm not the songwriter. Songs I picked out alone in my room for which I wrote the chord progression, the melody, the lyrics, the rhythm, not mine. The band's, not mine, not mine, not mine. The rest of Soul Coughing's tunes sound dreadful to me. Geeky. Weighed down with a waka waka vaudeville thing. Diseased with terminal uniqueness. Pompous. Crammed with ostentatious parts that barely acknowledge the songs, that fight to push the voice into the background, fight every other instrument because each guy's convinced his part's the most important. The really great instrumental parts are weakened, transformed from fantastic hooks to stumblers in a jumble. There's often a refusal to play something that would just make the listener feel good, because what's unique about that? Instead, those parts are self-consciously obscure, fake-sounding, insincere. Did I like the recordings when we made them? 2 answers of equal weight, the first being yes and no, the second I don't remember. I remember loving tracks in this way that seems manic, injected with denial. I remember loving tracks that now, should I hear them in a bar, nearly provoke me to jump over the bartender and bang my fist on the sound system's off button. I remember loving some tracks when I was high. I remember loving some tracks in a way that seems genuine, but in retrospect, but baffles me now. We were a relatively successful cult band, but I think that had my bandmates chosen to let me be a band leader, we could have been Led Zeppelin. That is an actual line in this book. How do you tell that to someone who loves an album? Yes, you love it so fiercely, but in my mind, I hear something so much better, and thus reject this thing you love. All the people who wrote us off as geeks, I will never reach out to them and say, there, it was something great here, but we failed to let you hear it. Okay? So that was his attitude on soul coughing at the time. And since then, in interviews, he talked about how horrible it was to be in the band. He called it an abusive relationship. Now, as is indicated by the title of this book, Mike was an addict at the time. He was on a lot of drugs. He was going through a lot of hardship. And the soul coughing experience was, wrapped up in all of that. So you can understand, you know, partially just from that alone, why he would feel so awful during that time. On top of that, yeah, Mike, I think, legitimately feels that he wrote these songs and he had a way they wanted them to sound, and his wishes were ignored, and the other guys in the band kind of just did what they wanted with them. A couple things complicate that for me. Number one, the other guys in the band are brilliant. Like, Mike's a great, really unique songwriter, and I don't want to take anything away from him, but just in terms of creativity and musical virtuosity, the other guys in the band are exceptional, and together they come together into this really powerful sound. Like, when I saw them live, it really hit home. I always knew the rhythm section was fantastic, but it really hit home how much the sampler player contributes and how he fills out the songs and makes them so much more interesting and so much more fun. And Mike's contribution was on a lot of songs, primarily lyrical. He would write all the lyrics, and a lot of the lyrics are wonderful. And he would play some kind of he would play guitar, but they were kind of sparse guitar parts. That was his thing. It's kind of sparse, kind of stark, and he would continue that into his early solo stuff. Um, so it's kind of weird to me that Mike would hire these guys to be his backing band, who he knew were these brilliant musicians who were very creative people, and just kind of wanted them to just play what he wanted them to play. Like, they're not session musicians. They're not, people who you hire to follow the sheet music. They're really great artists in their own rights. So it just kind of seems like they weren't able to collaborate in a healthy way. I mean, that's what you do, you know, in a group with other people who you trust when you're working on a creative project. You collaborate. It's never going to be exactly what it is in your head, but often, that can make it better. Other people coming in with ideas, and they'll come up with something you could have never thought of, and they'll contribute it, and it'll make the overall product just more interesting and unique. And I don't think that Mike was in a headspace where he could collaborate in a healthy way, and maybe the other guys weren't at that time either. But if you want to hear how much the other guys contributed to this music, contributed to Mike's songs, there is very strong evidence of that, because Mike re-recorded a lot of them in 2013, and he put out a record called Circles, Super Bon Bon, and the Very Best of Soul Coughing, where he re-recorded a bunch of soul coughing songs and kind of did them the way that he, would have done them at the time, supposedly. And they're just much less interesting. They have much less personality. They're kind of they're much more straightforward. And, there are a couple tracks I like on it. I like his take on the song Mr. Bitterness. I like both versions. I love the original Soul Coughing version, but I think Mike's version, does have kind of a different vibe to it, and I do also enjoy it. And there are a couple songs on there that I enjoy, but just for the most part, it's just so lacking in the stuff that made Soul Coughing such an interesting and unique band. So, clearly Mike was processing some stuff. There were years where he just wouldn't talk about Soul Coughing, and just wanted to ignore it and put it out of his mind and be like, I'm a different artist now, I'm a new guy now. But, when he released this book, he was talking about Soul Coughing a lot. And then he did this album where he tried to, kind of reclaim some of the Soul Coughing material for himself. And then he started playing the Soul Coughing songs live. He would even go on tours where he did only Soul Coughing songs. But for the most part, he would, do a mix again and do some of his solo stuff and Soul Coughing stuff in the same set. And this was the way it was for a while until he reached the next logical step, and he wrote a new Soul Coughing album. And he reached out to the other guys in the band. I do want to read one more quote from this. Someplace on the internet, the bass player was asked if there would ever be a reunion. Not unless one of us dies, he replied. And so, forever that was what fans believed, that there was absolutely no way this band was getting back together. But Mike tried, after he wrote this book, bad-mouthing everybody. His feelings evolved, and he wrote this new record, and he asked them, do you guys want to come back and release this as a Soul Coughing album? And they said no. And we don't know why they said no. I think it's because, and this is just personal opinion, Mike ended up releasing this stuff as a new side project called Ghost of Vroom, which is obviously tied back to Ruby Vroom, which is the first Soul Coughing album. And I just don't think most of the material is very good, to put it bluntly. And I think the other guys probably listened to it and were just like, this isn't up to the standard of our previous 3 records, and I think they were right to say that, if that is what they said, and, it is like tempting to imagine like what they could have brought to it. Like maybe they could have elevated that material and made it something more interesting. But, I think they were probably right to put off the reunion at that time. So now they're trying something else. And for this reunion, they're just playing the songs. They're being professional. They're playing the songs basically as they were recorded, with a couple little changes and adjustments. And anything else is going to have to wait. I did read an interview with the sampler player, and he basically confirmed all of this. First of all, they asked him, this tour is the first Soul Coughing tour in 25 years. What was the turning point when you realized everyone was on board? And he says, when Yuval and Sebastian said they would do it. So that's it. That's all he says. When the drummer and the bassist said they would do it, the sampler player was like, okay, I'll do it too. And then he says, have you discussed more touring plans with Soul Coughing, or do you see this as a one-off opportunity to mark the 30th anniversary of Ruby Vroom? And Mark says, I think we're all open, but first getting through this 5-week run. So nothing on the table as yet. So basically, it's like, all the fans are wondering, are they going to keep touring? Are they going to maybe even record new material? And basically he's saying, we don't know any of that now. We just have to get through these 5 weeks that they're going on this tour. Which seems very reasonable to me, considering where the relationships were when the band broke up. And then the interviewer says, Mike Doughty recently had a candid conversation about his mental health over the last few years on this podcast, Depression Mode, which is a clever title. Despite those challenges, he painted his current relationship with everyone in Soul Coughing as some of his most positive. How do you view the dynamics within the band now? And the sampler player says, we're being super professional, committed to our shared legacy, appreciating the love shown by our audiences. Is there a desire to get into the studio and record new music with the group? Sampler player says, not something that's been discussed or hinted at. So, basically that's how it felt. It felt like they were doing this, basically for the fans. They were very professional about it. They just went from song to song to song. There was like very little chit chat. There was very little interaction between the band members. There didn't seem to be like a lot of warmth there. Like you weren't watching this and being like, "Oh, great, they're friends again." It was just like, we're people who have a job to do. We're going to execute that job. That was kind of the emotional vibe of it. But there was, a lot of additional emotional impact there just because for a lot of us, this music was very important to us and we never thought we would have a chance to see this band live, because by the time Soul Coughing broke up, I was 10 years old. And so I became a fan of them, when I was a teenager, after they'd already broken up. And so I just assumed that, I would never have an opportunity to see them in concert. But I was really, really super into those records and into Mike's early solo records as well. And so to hear these songs that I just listened to over and over and over as a kid and throughout the years, and kind of mythologized in my head, like, what would that be like to see them play these songs live? It was really kind of surreal and wonderful to actually see it happen. I also recently came across an interview with Mike Doughty where he talked about, getting the band back together. Because I was really curious, obviously, when the band announced their reunion dates, to be like, well, what's everybody's relationships? Is everybody cool with each other? Because you would expect them to be like, no, you wrote an entire book where you said we were assholes who, treated you horribly. So it's like, why would we want to get back together? But, apparently they've all been able to move past that, which is great. So Mike only talks about getting the band back together for a little bit in this interview, but basically, the interviewer says, I raised my eyebrows a little bit when I saw you were going back on tour with Soul Coughing because I remember that split being pretty acrimonious. What led to this decision and this new tour? And Mike said, I started listening to the records again, and I just felt there was a case that needed to be made for those albums. And I just felt like it was time. And I find that quote a little bit aggravating because I don't think a case needs to be made for those albums. Those albums are beloved. They're kind of legendary at this point among, a certain subsection of music fans. I mean, if anybody needed a case to be made for those albums, it was Mike. He needed somebody to make a case to him for those albums because, we were all really hungry for this, and he was just like, no, this great music that you love that I helped create sucks, so I don't, definitely a case did not need to be made to me, or I would imagine the huge majority of the people who are in that audience for those albums. And then the interviewer says, what was the process of, were you in a place of forgiveness or were you in a place of negotiation? What was the psychology that led to reaching out to those guys? And Mike said, well, it was quite straightforward. I just emailed them, and, there was a bit of a back and forth, and everybody got on board. It was pretty quick. And, you can see he's not going very deep. So the interviewer keeps pressing him, and he says, what was that like internally for you? Because I went through some of the old interviews you've done. You've referred to soul coughing as an abusive relationship. And working in this situation, you use the term big fat cup of disappointment. And listening to those old songs. So what changed? And Mike says, I don't know. I guess I changed. And then he says the thing which I think is the big takeaway here and the most important quote. Because the interviewer asks, how so? And Mike says, well, gosh, it's sort of nebulous, but I don't harbor those kinds of feelings anymore. I mean, I feel as distant from whoever that person was as at that time I felt distant from the person who was in soul coughing. And that's a really interesting thing to say because that's what Mike said a lot on the promotional tour for this book, that he didn't even feel like the same guy who was in soul coughing. Like he would listen to those recordings and not even feel like it was him, like he was that emotionally distant from it. And now he's saying that he feels that same way about the guy who wrote this book, that he feels distant from the Mike that wrote this book, as distant as the Mike who wrote this book felt from the Mike who was in that band. So I think that's really fascinating. Um, and then, Mike says, when did the band break up originally? Mike says 2000. The interviewer brings up that that's a long journey, 24-year-old journey. Again, I keep going back to this because I find this idea of, and then he sighs, I don't know if it's a toxic memory, hard memory, traumatic memory, working through to the point where you are. I find that to be pretty surprising. I think some bands get together like this to make some money. I don't get the sense that that's the impetus here. And I think he's right about that because, this band could have cashed out in a major way. They could be playing like huge festivals, and making tons of money, but they're not. They're playing like medium-sized venues. In fact, I think they underestimated how popular the tour would be because a lot of the venues, including the one I was at, it was originally booked for a smaller venue and then they had to move it to a bigger place because of demand, and open up more tickets. Um, so, yeah, I don't think it's a cash grab at all. Um, and so I guess if you say that's how you've changed, what's been the evolution of your relationship with trauma and acrimony over the last several years? And Mike says, I do think I used to be a more resentful person, which I have become much less of lately. I mean, the last 2-3 years have been pretty traumatic for me, and I came out the other side just much less resentful than I was going into it. I mean, all those bad memories are still real, and the characterization of the relationship is real. I'm just very different now. I don't know if I can articulate it any more aptly than that. Honestly, it's occurred to me that until this conversation, I hadn't been asked to articulate it more aptly than that. So that's interesting that he's definitely gotten to a place emotionally where he's okay with playing these songs again, being around these guys again, ready to bring the band back. But he has trouble putting it into words and just kind of explaining how he reached at that place, how he felt that way, how he came to feel that way, and it's just all pretty fascinating from a psychological level, I think. But the important thing is, they're back together, and they're obviously not, best buds or anything, but they're able to work together. They're able to make great music together, and that's more than fans seemingly could have hoped for a long time. So I know I've already been rambling for a bit, but I should probably actually talk about whether or not the show was good. That might be kind of important in a review of a show. I will say, me and my friend, who's also a huge Soul Coughing fan, drove. We drove 5 miles there, 5 miles back to see this. Um, and so, I guess the most pertinent question is, was it worth it? And I would say absolutely. I mean, I think we very much both agreed on that this was a very special experience, that it was totally worth all the effort and all the time. it took to make it happen. Like I kind of said earlier, it was just the thrill of seeing these songs that you've loved for so long, and you literally thought it would be impossible to ever see them live. Because that's what they said over the years. All the band members, especially Doty, who wrote kind of an entire book about it. But all of the band members said, we're never getting back together. That's not a thing. I mean, there's a reason the tour is called "We Said It Would Never Happen." It's because that's what they said. So we just assumed. It seemed legit. It seemed like, yeah, there's no way that's going to happen. It ended in too ugly of a fashion, but it happened. And like I said, it was the mood was not warm exactly, but they sounded great. They sounded great. There wasn't a ton of stage banter. They kind of kept it moving, song after song after song. Um, there was even a point near the end of the show where Mike did this kind of funny joke where he explained the structure of the show, where he was just like, we're going to play a song, and then we're going to pretend that the show is over, and we're going to leave the stage, and then we're going to come back on stage and act surprised and play two more songs. And which was like, it was like kind of cynical, but it was really funny. And and then they didn't even end up leaving the stage in between the main set and the encore. They were just like, like walk a couple steps over that way and then come back. And Mike was like, wow, we're really shocked that this is happening right now. And then they played two more songs. And he did acknowledge the other guys by name. He introduced them a few times. So I would say, yeah, the mood was professional. It was, conciliatory, but it was not. It was not like we're all best friends again. Which would have been nice to see, but I wouldn't expect that. And as far as the set goes, I mean, if you're not a big fan, this probably doesn't have that much significance to you. But I can go through it a little bit. I mean, you know, this is kind of an anniversary tour for Ruby Vroom in a way. So as you would imagine, that got the lion's share of it. There were 10 songs from Ruby Vroom as opposed to like 6 from LO So 5 from Irresistible Bliss. So pretty much half of the show was Ruby Vroom songs. And so they played, some of the big ones you'd expect, like, True Dreams of Wichita, and Screenwriter's Blues, which surprised me for some reason. But in retrospect, of course they're going to play Screenwriter's Blues. I was kind of used to Mike, because he playing some of these songs acoustically, and obviously you can't really do Screenwriter's Blues with like just you and an acoustic guitar. The production of it is like a hugely important part of that song and why it works. So that was wonderful to hear. But then they also played some great deep cuts from Ruby Vroom, as you'd imagine, like the Blue Eyed Devil. I really didn't expect to hear. Um, Moon Sammy. I will say, like, not only did I not expect to hear that one, but it wasn't even really on my wish list because like I always thought it was a good song, but it was never like one of my personal favorites. But I think performance-wise, that song was maybe the highlight of the night for me, just in terms of the actual performance, but there were just tons of great moments. I mean, opening with I Miss the Girl from El Oso was super cool because, it didn't, I never imagined it as an opener. I think we both assumed that they would open with the Chicago is Not Chicago just because they were playing in Chicago. And also, that's a song they open with a lot. It's the first song on their first album. And so, like, right off the bat, getting this, like, awesome kind of deep cut that it's always been one of my favorites was just such a cool way to start. And then, there were songs like Collapse and Disseminated from Irresistible Bliss that were definitely on my list of songs I would have wanted to hear, but I never imagined I would actually get to hear them. It was so cool. And I mean, they just played these songs that are really important to me, like True Dreams of Wichita and St. Louise's Listening and The Idiot Kings, which is maybe my single favorite Soul Coughing song. So, I mean, the set list was fantastic, and it wasn't just. I was assuming, it was going to kind of be like a greatest hit set list, but it wasn't that at all. They did play some of their more popular songs. Of course, they're going to play Circles and Super Bon Bon, uh, but they played a lot of stuff that I never would have imagined in a million years that they would have played, and it was really thrilling. Um, and the band sounded great. Like it really brought home that everyone is an equal partner in the sound. Everyone is equally important. You know, and just the cacophony that those three musicians behind Mike, that are able to create is so specific to them, and just sounds so wonderful. And then Mike's lyrics on top of that. I mean, it's this. It's odd to me that Mike was just like, for so long that they ruined his songs because they brought so much to his songs. They're just great musicians, and they're just really creative people, and they I think they just elevated that material so much on the records, and they elevated it so much live. And I mean, they played for about 90 minutes, which is great, and as you can see, 21 songs, which is a good amount of songs. And yeah, they kept it moving, they kept it fast, but it was fantastic. It sounded great. I mean, Mike, his voice has changed over the years. At the time he was a very different person. He's a lot more kind of laid back now. So it was kind of a different vibe coming from him, but it was good. I mean, he definitely did what he needed to do and more. And the other guys just sounded awesome. Um, so yeah, I mean, overall, that's my review. That it was fantastic. That it was totally worth traveling for. That I felt it was a very special experience, and I hope it comes around again. I hope they tour again. I would love to hear new material from them, whether it lives up to the old stuff or not. I would just, I would be very into hearing it and seeing for myself. That would be exciting. But I don't know if it's going to go anywhere from here or if this is it. But if this is it, you know me and my friend were talking about after the show. The previous ending of this band was really sad when they broke up in 2000. That they all hated each other, and everybody was angry at everybody else, and they were reaching this pinnacle of success, and then they just kind of threw it away because they couldn't make the relationships work. And I mean, Mike's drug problems obviously played into that as well. He really needed help at the time, and he ended up getting that help, and getting clean. You know, and this, even if it doesn't go beyond this little tour, this is a much nicer way to end that story. That they were able to put aside their differences and get up on stage and play these songs again, and it actually sounded good, and it sounded passionate. It sounded like they gave a shit about the material, and they wanted to execute it really well for the fans. To as like a gift to us. You know, to put all that personal stuff aside to make us happy, and maybe to make a little money themselves. But there's nothing wrong with that. Once again, this did not feel like a cynical kind of cash grab, at all. It felt like a really nice thing to do for the fans after 24 years, and I loved it very much. It was very special for me, and that's about it. It was great. All right, well, I think I've gone on and on long enough, and that is